In my mid-20s, I worked the graveyard shift at a small convenience store called Quick Stop. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills while I juggled online classes. Most nights were uneventful, just me, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the occasional customer. The store was tucked away on the edge of town, surrounded by empty fields and a few scattered houses. It wasn't the kind of place people visited unless they had to. I'd bring my laptop to work, hoping to squeeze in some studying during the long, quiet hours. For the most part, it worked out. The store rarely got busy, and I could easily set my laptop aside whenever someone wandered in. But there was always something eerie about the stillness of those late nights, especially when the weather turned bad. One particularly cold and rainy night, I was deep into an assignment, typing away at my laptop. The storm had been raging for hours, and the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows was almost soothing. I hadn't seen a single customer in nearly 2 hours, and I was grateful for the solitude. The store felt like a bubble, isolated from the rest of the world. But that peace was shattered when the front door creaked open. A man stepped inside, shaking water from his jacket. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a scruffy beard and short dark hair. His clothes were damp, and he carried an air of restlessness. I quickly closed my laptop and set it aside, ready to assist him. He didn't approach the counter, though. Instead, he wandered through the aisles, glancing at the shelves as if he were searching for something specific. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated. After a minute or two, he left without buying anything. I shrugged it off and went back to my work, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was off. About half an hour later, I noticed headlights pulling into the parking lot. I glanced up and my stomach dropped. It was the same car from earlier. The same man stepped out, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. This time, he walked straight to the counter. Before I could even move my laptop, he asked, "Where's your restroom?" I pointed to the small hallway behind him. "It's right over there," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded and headed in that direction. The restroom was a single occupancy one, not a large multi-stall setup. I found it odd that he'd come back just to use the bathroom. Surely there were closer places he could have gone unless he'd been lingering nearby the whole time. Minutes ticked by, and he didn't come out. 10 minutes turned into 20, and I started to feel uneasy. I didn't want to be the person who knocked on the door or checked up on him, but something about the situation felt wrong. The store was too quiet, the rain too loud, and the restroom door seemed to loom larger than it should. Just as I was debating what to do, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. The officer drove slowly, circling the lot before stopping behind the man's car. He got out and inspected the vehicle, shining a flashlight through the windows. My heart began to race. The officer entered the store, his eyes scanning the aisles before landing on me.
"Do you know who owns that car outside?" he asked, his tone sharp and urgent. He wasn't just curious, he was worried.
I gestured toward the restroom. "He's been in there for a while," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The officer didn't hesitate. He marched over to the restroom door and began banging on it. "Open up!" he shouted. There was no response. After a moment, he turned to me. "Do you have a key to this door?" I fumbled through the drawer under the counter, my hands shaking as I searched for the key. Finally, I found it and handed it to him. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, his gun drawn. The room was empty. I stared in disbelief. "He was in there," I insisted. "I saw him go in. He never came out." The officer stepped inside and looked around. His flashlight beam swept across the ceiling, and he paused. The ceiling was made of removable panels, the kind you could push aside if you needed access to the space above. The officer reached up and pushed one of the panels, revealing a gaping hole. "He's in the ceiling," the officer muttered, more to himself than to me. He called for backup, and within minutes the store was swarming with police. They found the man hiding in the ceiling, crouched between the beams. He was arrested on the spot. Later, I learned the full story. The man had been on the run after committing a series of violent crimes earlier that night. The police had been searching for him, and they'd tracked his car to the Quick Stop. The officers told me I was lucky. His previous victims had been alone, just like me, and none of them had walked away unharmed. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Had he been hiding in the ceiling to evade capture, or was he waiting for the right moment to strike? I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that I'll never forget the sound of that restroom door creaking open, or the sight of the officer's flashlight illuminating the empty room. The man is behind bars now, serving a life sentence. But even though he's locked up, I still feel a chill every time I remember that rainy night at the Quick Stop. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The store felt different, as if the walls themselves held the memory of that night. I started carrying pepper spray and kept my phone within reach at all times. My manager offered to let me switch shifts, but I declined. I didn't want to let fear dictate my life. One night as I was closing up, I noticed something strange. The restroom ceiling panel was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I called the police, but they found nothing. Still, the incident left me on edge. A few months later, I quit my job at Quick Stop. I finished my degree and moved to a new city, hoping to leave the past behind. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the rain against the windows, and I'm transported back to that store. I see the man's face, the empty restroom, and the gaping hole in the ceiling. I've learned that some stories don't have neat endings. Some questions remain unanswered, and some fears never fully go away. But I've also learned the importance of trusting my instincts. That night, something told me to be wary, and it might have saved my life. The Quick Stop is still there, though it's under new management. I drive by it sometimes when I visit my hometown. The lights are still bright, the aisles still stocked, and the restroom door still creaks when it opens. But for me, it will always be a place of shadows and secrets, a reminder of the night I came face to face with danger and walked away. I used to live in the heart of the city. The urban grind, the constant hum of life, it was what I thought I wanted. But after a traumatic event I'd rather not delve into, I found myself unable to tolerate even the faintest sounds. Noise became my enemy. My therapist diagnosed me with a rare condition called phonophobia. Imagine the prickling sensation you feel when your foot falls asleep. But instead, it's in your chest, a constant gnawing tension, as if my body was bracing for an unseen threat. Every honk, every slammed door felt like a knife to my nerves. I couldn't go on like that. 3 years ago, I stumbled upon a cabin hidden deep in the Cascade Mountains. I won't disclose its exact location, for reasons that will soon become clear. But let's just say it was nestled in a remote part of Washington. It seemed perfect. No neighbors, no traffic, barely any cell service. What sealed the deal was the silence. It was just me and the stillness. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of safety. The cabin was small but charming, exactly as the listing had described. Thick wooden beams, a sturdy stone fireplace, and the faint scent of pine and aged paper greeted me when I stepped inside. It felt like stepping into a forgotten world. The nearest neighbor, an elderly woman named Clara, lived about a 10-minute walk down a narrow, winding trail. I didn't meet her right away. For the first few days, I simply basked in the quiet. Birdsong replaced sirens, and at night, the only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. It was as if the world had paused, and I could finally breathe. I worked remotely, so there was no need to venture beyond the cabin. But about a week after I moved in, there was a knock at the door. No doorbell, just 3 sharp raps that echoed through the stillness. I opened it to find Clara standing there, clutching a basket of homemade preserves. She looked like she'd stepped out of a different era. Long silver hair, piercing green eyes, and a demeanor that was both welcoming and unsettling. She introduced herself and mentioned she lived down the trail, though the dense woods made the distance feel much greater. Clara wasn't rude, but she was intense. She handed me the basket with a firmness that left no room for refusal. Her gaze lingered, as if she were waiting for me to say something profound. When I simply thanked her, she leaned in and said, "Keep your lanterns full, your windows locked, and your wits sharper than your blade." Her words hung in the air like a warning. I nodded, smiled, and closed the door, but I could hear her standing there for nearly a minute before her footsteps finally retreated. The encounter left me uneasy, but I brushed it off. Clara seemed eccentric, not dangerous. I set the basket on the kitchen counter and didn't think much of it. Until that night, a thunderstorm rolled in, which was unusual for the region. The power flickered, so I lit a few candles and curled up with a book. The storm's natural sounds didn't bother me. In fact, I found them soothing. But then, around midnight, there was a loud, frantic banging at the door. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window. It was Clara, drenched and wide-eyed. She blurted out that she'd seen someone near my woodpile and thought I should know. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The rain made it impossible to see anything beyond the trees. Clara's eyes darted nervously toward the woods as she repeated her warning. Before I could respond, she turned and disappeared into the storm, leaving me standing there, drenched and confused. Back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. How had Clara seen someone near my woodpile if she lived 10 minutes away? Had she been on my property? And why would she be out in a storm? The questions gnawed at me as I locked the doors and windows, my nerves on edge. Hours later, I woke to the sound of a branch snapping outside my bedroom window. I crept to the window and froze. Clara was standing at the edge of the woods, her back to the cabin. Her hair was wild, her posture tense. As I watched, she began to turn toward the house. I ducked below the window, my heart pounding. When I dared to look again, she was gone. The next morning, I decided to confront her. But when I reached her cabin, I was met with an unsettling sight. The place was abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. My mind raced. Who or what had I been talking to? That night, as I lay in bed, the cabin was enveloped in an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden beams settling. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press against the walls. Just as I began to drift into an uneasy sleep, I heard it. A soft, almost hesitant knock at the door. It was so faint that at first I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time, sending a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. My heart pounded as I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. I crept to the window, my breath shallow, and peered through the glass. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't Clara. Standing on my porch was a burly man, his silhouette hulking and menacing in the dim moonlight. His face was shadowed, but I could make out a thick, unkempt beard and eyes that glinted with an unsettling intensity. He stood unnervingly still, his gaze fixed on the door as if he could see right through it. My mind raced. Who was he? What did he want? And why was he here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? Panic surged through me as I backed away from the window, my movements slow and deliberate to avoid making a sound. I retreated to the bathroom, the only room with a lock, and closed the door as quietly as I could. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The operator's voice was calm, but I could barely whisper my location over the sound of my own frantic breathing. As I spoke, a loud, splintering crash echoed through the cabin, the sound of the front door being forced open. My stomach dropped. He was inside. I crouched in the corner of the bathroom, clutching my phone like a lifeline, as the man began to ransack the cabin. The sounds were deafening. Furniture being overturned, glass shattering, wood splintering under the force of his blows. Each noise sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle any sound, my mind racing with horrifying possibilities. What if he found me? What if he wasn't alone? The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally the sound stopped. The cabin fell into an unnatural silence, broken only by the faint hum of the operator's voice on the other end of the line. When the police arrived, it felt like hours had passed, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. They searched the property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but the man was long gone. The officers were dismissive, almost indifferent, as I pleaded with them to investigate Clara's cabin. "No one's lived there in years," one of them said with a shrug, as if that explained everything. Their lack of urgency infuriated me. Didn't they understand? Something was deeply wrong here, and I felt like I was the only one who could see it. I moved out the next day, my nerves frayed and my mind haunted by the events of that night. The experience has stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow I can't shake. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of it. Some people have suggested that Clara was a spirit, a guardian of sorts, trying to protect me from the man who broke into my cabin. Others think she and the man were squatters, working together in some twisted scheme, though I can't understand why she would warn me if she meant me harm. The truth is, I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that silence can be deceiving. In the woods, where the world feels so far away, it's easy to believe you're alone. But sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are all too real, and the line between the living and the dead, or the sane and the unhinged, is far thinner than we'd like to believe. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something far darker than I'll ever fully understand. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, I still hear that soft, hesitant knock at the door, a reminder that the woods hold secrets I may never unravel. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more creepy stories, and stay safe.